So we can start from this most basic question, like what ecofeminism really even is. And like I said, it is primarily a movement that tries to connect tries to find connections between ecological issues and feminist issues, and it does this in a few aspects. It is most dominantly a theoretical framework. It analyzes history, sociology, societal relations, politics, and kind of tries to make clear this in a theoretical way, like why these connections exist, like where, for example, the destruction of the environment comes from, and in what way is the destruction of the environment related to the oppression of women and the oppression in general that's related to gender, but also even more widely, like global injustice and so on. And so it can maybe seem a bit too abstract at times. Some of this ecofeminist theory, maybe it can be a little, just on a purely theoretical basis, something that may not have like an immediate practical application that's immediately obvious. But it also is, like the term ecofeminism also does involve a lot of this kind of practical activist engagement with issues that affect both, that are both related to gender depression of women and gender depression in general, as well as environmental destruction. So there are ecofeminists, especially ecofeminists in developing countries, are very much engaged in like very real, very concrete struggles that are both ecological and feminist at the same time, in the sense that they can't really be separated. And I think for a lot of us who are living in more developed countries, maybe like the Balkans don't necessarily qualify, but more developed than, for example, countries in sub-Saharan Africa, this connection may not seem so immediate. And whereas for a lot of, if you talk to some third world activists that are engaged in these struggles, they will it might seem kind of very clearly obvious to them that environmental destruction does also impact women in a gendered way. And yeah, the word actually was first used by Francois de Boom, my French pronunciation sucks, I'm sorry, who is a French I think she isn't alive anymore. Yeah. She was a French feminist thinker and activist, and she first used it in her book in 1974, where she kind of made these theoretical connections as how patriarchy. Does everybody know what patriarchy means?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. How patriarchy and male domination leads to the destruction of the environment and vice versa, how these things are related. We can see here feminists engaged in environmental protests. I think this is in the UK. And this is Francois de Boom.
Also the woman.
Okay, Francois de Boom. The author that first actually coined the term ecofeminism. However, she did not, I wouldn't necessarily say invent this movement. She maybe just articulated it in a very more explicit way than it had been before. In general, and it's not accidental, when these kind of discourses first started appearing, which is in the 70s, and it kind of arose out of these social movements in the 1960s and 1970s, that were happening. There was more awareness of environmental issues. For example, one of the first major ecological issues was raised in the 1960s with The Silent Spring, which was a book that discussed how chemicals in agriculture affect the environment and how they affect human health and so on. It's actually like in the 1960s, environmental awareness was like really starting up again, and in general as part of a revival of a lot of social movements. And one of those social movements was, of course, feminism as well, which started booming in the 60s and especially in the 70s with this sort of second wave, where like for a while the feminist movement had kind of died down, but in this period there was a really big revival. So it was all of these struggles were happening simultaneously, along with, for example, anti-colonial struggles, anti-racist struggles, and so it kind of makes sense that around this period they would be articulated in a theoretical way as well, and kind of because that's what people were thinking about, that's what people were concerned with, and these connections became more obvious than maybe they had been before. Obviously, I mean, as with all things, there are precursors. There are things that kind of happen that, like, you could point to and say, "Oh, somebody already had this insight," like in the 19th century, for example, and so on. But really, the movement of ecofeminism kind of starts around this time, like the 1960s, 1970s. Yeah, which is what I said. Ecological awareness and re-emergent feminist movements allow these issues to be viewed together. Also, one huge component of ecofeminism has always been this more spiritual side, this kind of, we'll talk about that a bit more as well later on, but this kind of spiritual connection with nature has always been at least a little bit present, not just in ecofeminist movements, but in ecological movements in general. And that's something that's often criticized, but it's also something that is in any case, a large motivator, for people to kind of spiritually connect with nature, can be a motivator for them to try to protect it and want to protect it. And in the 1960s and into the 1970s, there was a lot of this revival of some more nature-oriented spirituality, and as well a more female-oriented spirituality that didn't necessarily have like classical religions, like this patriarchal domination, this male part of nature. And then we have this discussion about the enclosure of the commons, as well as colonialism. That feminists who come from a more Marxist background are usually put more focus on this. It is generally in the same time period, like that we're talking about, like this early modern period, but it puts more of a focus on the economic side of issues, like it views the kind of the ideas that came out of this period as being a consequence of economic processes that were happening during this time. Again, yeah, I asked you already if you have come across this term, the commons. Does anybody maybe know how to explain it? What it really means, or
something that's shared in a community.
Okay. Is anybody maybe familiar with some Marxist theories?
Yeah, I read the Manifest of Communism.
Okay. Okay, so maybe you might be familiar with what they're talking about. But basically, the idea is that in the early periods of capitalism, as it was starting in the early modern period, what happened was a lot of land that was available for the whole community, that was used by the community, started to be privatized. It was given to specific owners for them to use, which led to, poor, to people who used to be free peasants suddenly being unable to have access to land that they used to have access to, and were forced off of it, and had to work either in cities for wages, or to work for the people who now owned the land that used to belong to everybody. Fields and forests that were used by, for example, a whole village community were now just the property of one person. And what this often led to is a worsening of the position of women who relied on these common resources. But now, as it turned towards a more capitalist economy, they became just basically house slaves, like people working completely tied to the home, and just working within like this private sphere, whereas the men were the ones who were now forced to earn wages. But at the same time, this also led to a more intense exploitation of land resources. It led to destruction of forests, destruction of fields, and more intensive agriculture, which then led to industrialization and so on and so on. That's like a general overview. Maybe I feel like maybe like all of these topics we could like get really deeply into. There was a lot to talk about, and I think they're all really, really interesting. But like I said, other ecofeminists tend to locate this kind of source of oppression, of patriarchal domination, much earlier, in the period of like the agricultural revolution, and this shift from female-oriented deities like goddesses, worshiping like Mother Nature, towards a worship of sky gods, of male gods, who were then often viewed as kings and so on. And they view this as the fundamental root of patriarchal oppression, like where it comes from, like tens of thousands of years ago, and they view all of these later developments as just manifestations of a culture that was already created. Yeah, I'm sorry, we're not. There's so much stuff that we could get into, but I don't think we have time. This is something that I find interesting. How like this can be viewed like in language, in the way language is used. This linking of the oppression of women and the ecological destruction, where words that are used for women are often like words that are also used for animals and for nature, and also the way that nature is talked about is often very feminine. Like virgin forest or Mother Nature, and like hurricanes get like the female names, and so like it is a kind of an interesting, I think, point to make when talking about how these things are actually like connected and coming from the same place. But okay, let's talk about some more practical, concrete stuff. I picked a few topics that I found interesting, few examples that we can cover about how environmental destruction and climate change don't affect everyone equally. Of course, I mean, this firstly reflects on the fact that people from developing countries are much more affected by climate change, by environmental destruction, than people in Western Europe or the United States, even though they aren't as responsible for climate change and for the destruction. But women in those communities are often affected in different ways than men are, and in fact, in quite disproportionate ways. For example, women do most of the agricultural work in African countries, both for food production as well as for market production. So I think it's interesting that agriculture in Europe here is perceived as something that's done by men, but in fact, a lot of our food, most of our food, is produced by women living in third world countries. And so floods and and other disruptions, fires and what is it called? Drought. Yeah, they affect like the women who are producing the food because they can't really. They're the ones who are actually doing the work. But also at the same time, most of the time, women, even though they're the ones doing most of the work, they are not the ones who own the property. They're working either for large corporations or their husbands or fathers are the ones who own the land. So, yeah, there's a lot of like complex intersections here. This is a very interesting quote and very interesting topic, but I don't think we're going to get into it. It's a bit too long.
We are going to get the presentation, right?
Yeah, I can send it to you. Another key issue that's often talked about when it comes to environmentalism is population growth. You know, especially in certain circles, there's this view: oh, there's too many humans on the planet, population is growing, blah blah blah, and so we need to kind of stop or slow down population growth. And there is some truth to that, but of course it can often go into like a bit of a racist, colonialist view, because most population growth is happening in third world countries, whereas first world countries are slowing down their population growth, and some even have like negative population growth, like I think in Serbia. But the way that this is like often approached by especially by like Western governments is quite problematic, not just from this perspective that it's a bit racist and a bit colonialist and be like, oh, you need to like stop reproducing, but also like from a feminist perspective, because you know it is in some way an attempt by these countries to kind of control women's bodies, to control, and not just women's bodies, but in general, like to control like reproduction, and like take these choices away from the people who should have, you know, this freedom of choice, which is one of the main tenets of the feminist movement. But also they often don't really understand like the reasons why there's so much population growth, because it's not and these programs usually just amount to either giving birth control to these groups, these parts of the world that have higher population growth than others, or state policies that encourage making less children and so on, but these tend to be very ineffective. What does tend to be effective is women having more rights, women having more control over their lives, and having access to better health care, because what usually happens is women are in these much more traditional societies are usually tied to the home, and like they don't own property, they don't have job opportunities, and so they have to be married, they have to have a husband and have children if they want to survive, if they want to have any sort of income, and so raising education, opening job opportunities helps women have more options. But also a reason why a lot of families have more children in these places is because there's not enough access to healthcare, and a lot of children die very young. And so if you have more children, there's a higher chance that more of them will survive. And studies have shown that where women get more educated, where they have better job opportunities, and where infant mortality is reduced, those are the places where population starts to slow down. Then we can also talk about militarism and war, which are also do affect the environment in quite a large way. Like, for example, the United States military produces more CO2 than most countries in the world. It would, if there was its own country, it would be the 47th largest greenhouse gas emitter. And it also affects women disproportionately as well, with women and children comprising from 75 to 95% of all war refugees. There's not a lot left. I won't bore you too much longer, but one thing that I also think is important to cover and maybe interesting is animal agriculture, which has been approached from both an ecological side and from a feminist side. Ecofeminists are in a unique position to kind of make this connection even strong, like to make a connection between these two different views, because animal agriculture is a huge source of greenhouse gas emissions. It is a huge source of deforestation, and it uses much more land that we would need to use if we were not eating animals and not eating animal products. So there will be much more land available to feed more people, but also to just leave alone and to not destroy more and more ecosystems. But then at the same time, there is this feminist critique of animal agriculture, which comes from this idea of bodily autonomy and why animals are not allowed to have autonomy over their bodies, why they're forced to reproduce, and in general why they're kind of viewed as objects in much the same way that society treats women, and it treats other oppressed human groups. It treats animals in a similar way. Like, for example, we saw in some other previous slides, I think we can make this connection that whenever you want to use a derogatory term for someone, comparing them to an animal is a way to go. So there's this. This is one of the connections that I find most interesting, that some ecofeminists have written really interesting stuff about. One more major topic that we can cover is the connections in political organizing, and which is basically that women and in general gender diverse people as well, people who fall outside the gender binary, who are queer and so on, have had a tendency to be leaders within the environmental movement. And this is true both in developed countries and in developing countries. I don't know if that's something that you have noticed, but I can see, for example, in this group, it is mostly dominated by people who aren't men, I would say. I don't know if I'm correct, and maybe that's something that you have noticed. I don't know if you have noticed this in your local context as well. Women being more involved in environmental work and activism.
Yes. Very few women actually.
Okay. And we can talk about also the reasons why that is. All the practical examples that we covered before can maybe account for a little bit of that. Where there's a very concrete issue that's both feminist and both ecological. It makes sense that the people who are most affected by it are the ones who are on the front lines, but it also doesn't really explain it fully, because sometimes there isn't this element. For example, I think for a lot of first world people, the connection between gender depression and environmental oppression isn't really so obvious, and it's something that needs to be explained and theorized about. It's not as concretely related, but still you have in the environmental movement mostly women and people who are not men dominating, and a lot some more essentialist-minded feminist thinkers, especially in the second wave of the feminist movement, like have attributed this to like again some more spiritual or biological evolutionary connections that women have with nature. Like women are more nurturing, they're more maternal by nature, and so they have an inherent connection to protecting wildlife. But this is a perspective that has been heavily criticized because, you know, it limits women to this role. You know, they're just like they have to be caring, they have to be maternal. You know, that's a very oppressive kind of patriarchal way of thinking. And, you know, it's not deconstructing this role. But yeah, and it's also been yeah, it's been generally like something that's criticized, and that doesn't really help. I would say explain why it is. This is also a really good quote. But yeah, from a constructivist perspective of gender subjectivity, we can consider that women's interest in caring for nature is not an automatic mechanism that's related to gender. It's just that reality presents us with a wide range of individuals, but it also has trends that are linked to the socialization of some tasks and attitudes. And in general, women have been the ones who are responsible for caring and taking care of the most vulnerable, as well as maintaining material infrastructure like kitchen, clothes, and so on. And this has led to, like, sociologically speaking, developing a kind of relational subjectivity, which means that women are have a better, pay more attention to others, and show greater affection towards other human beings. But this is not an inherent trait, it's something that's a result of the way our society is structured and the way things are kind of internalized. And when these characteristics are complemented with appropriate information and a critical approach to dominant discourses, then there's the conditions are created for women to develop an interest in the defense of nature and other living beings. Again, I don't know if you're able to maybe follow this. Is it maybe a bit too abstract? Do you get what I? Okay. Okay, now we have some examples of activists. You probably know who this is.
Yeah.
And then we have Anuna de Viver, who is a non-binary climate activist, and they were one of the main organizers of the climate strikes in Belgium. Zia Bastida, who is both female and indigenous. She was one of the most prominent organizers of Fridays for Future in the United States. We have Vandana Shiva. I don't know if anybody's heard of her before. She is also a very prominent ecofeminist writer. She's also a scientist and also an activist. She's very actively engaged in these struggles in India against genetically modified organisms and privatizing of land and destruction of the environment and so on. We have Petra Kelly, who is somebody that I personally quite admire. She was a German ecofeminist writer, activist, and politician, one of the founders of the German Green Party, and in general, one of the founders of the global green movement. And then we have examples of organizing. Here we have indigenous women in Brazil who are fighting to protect Babaçu palm forests from deforestation, which is both an environmental concern, right? They're trying to protect these forests from being destroyed, but at the same time, they live off of these forests. They collect the fruit, and it's related to their kind of traditional way of life. And this destruction would impact them in a very concrete way. And maybe this one is closer to home. Women in Bosnia fighting against micro hydropower plants. This is probably something all of you are familiar with. But yeah, it's interesting that it was the women of the village that were the ones that are most organized and most prominent. And finally, we can cover some critical perspectives on ecofeminist theory, which has been criticized, like I said, from various points of view, including by ecofeminists themselves. As I previously mentioned, one of the critiques is that it can be a bit essentialist, tying women to these roles of like mother, nurturer, and especially in its more kind of spiritual forms, there is this tendency towards that. And that instead of that, we should be deconstructing these roles, that we can be aware of them, but we shouldn't be viewing them as something necessarily positive. And then other feminist authors have criticized what they perceive as anti-rationalist strains within the movement, which I think is an issue to a certain extent. Some of the historiography by certain ecofeminist writers has been a bit problematic, criticized, and certain views on some scientific topics have also been criticized, for example, on the issue of GMOs. But I think in general, like even if certain points can be criticized when it comes to like facts and certain points of view, I think the general perspective of ecofeminism, this general kind of linking of the environmental oppression and gendered oppression, patriarchy, does stand. Even if you can find like some holes in it, the general overview I think is worth, if nothing else, investigating and thinking about. And okay, that's it for the presentation. I think we're done on time.
2 minutes.
Cool. Okay. I thought it was gonna